Okay. Hope you guys are doing well here in almost mid July. Hope your summer's going good. We're going to talk about Carlin today, George. That's George Carlin. Um, because he kind of took, if you couldn't tell, he kind of took what Richard Pryor and Lenny Bruce were doing, took what took what they were doing and really sort of brought it all together to to form his uh, his his career um, going forward. And I may have mentioned this in the description, but had a very similar. He was kind of like right there with Pryor in terms of like just the same concept of what it means to be a comedian, right? And at the time, it was like I said before, it was like as he dubs it in the little interview video, a mainstream dream, right? Something that people had already achieved before. He uses Danny Kaye as an example, right? A song and dance man, right? Tell some jokes, sing some songs. It's like what was this? The path was like, you know, you're a DJ, you're a disc jockey or something, right? And then you make some albums, and then you get on TV, and then you get a TV show or you get a movie or like whatever, and that's it. Um, so it's really interesting to hear him talk about that very specifically. Pryor didn't really talk about it specifically. Talking about that and then realizing like, wait, what am I doing? Right, the fuck it moment that we've mentioned before. That many that most of us, if not all of us, have at one point or another. It's better to have um, yeah, it's better to have many of them, a few of them early than many of them late in life. Like, yeah, you don't want to get to my age. I'll be 50 in a couple weeks. You don't want to get to my age and be like, oh, uh, you know, you're just not in a position to fuck it as much as if you're, in your 20s or whatever. Um, but anyway, he talks about that, like, and he kind of in doing so talks about the American dream in general, which is such an interesting thing to talk about if you really think about it. What's the American dream? Well, the American dream used to be, have a husband and a wife, or wife, not and a wife, husband or wife, a couple kids, a house, a car, very attainable, very simple things. That was the American dream. And what is it now? It's money, cash, hoes, right? Like it's to be a Kardashian. It's the American dream is excess. The American dream is materialistic. Um, and Carlin's talking about like what that can do is it can it can lure you away from being who you really are, who you were meant to be. Um, and he talks about it in that little interview, right, where he was like, I caught myself like I was 30, I'm in nightclubs entertaining 40-year-olds while 20-year-olds are in the streets like protesting and doing all these other things, and I felt like I'm way more 20 than I am 40 right now. And that's when he sort of redefined his comedic approach and started really talking about all the things that you guys highlighted in your comments, right? Like religion and government and politics and sex and race and gender, like all the things that people love to talk about in college courses, like this one. Um, so having the fuck it moment, having this, realizing that the mainstream dream isn't for everyone. It arguably shouldn't be for anyone, right? Um, and that's sort of where you start to get um, all this Carlin stuff. Carlin, to me, like one of the things that I don't know if it's a direct quote of his, but he says, I'm paraphrasing his whole like aesthetic basically is bullshit's easy, right? We'd rather coast with the bullshit than grapple with the truth, right? I think that holds true today more than ever before. But he's talking about it through, most of his career. He's talking about that concept, right? Um, we'd rather coast with the bullshit than grapple with the truth. Like he says, I think in one of his specials, one of those things he's talking about, um, if you introduced honesty to politics, it would throw like people wouldn't know what to do with it. Like if you, yeah, it would throw everything off, and things would be, you know, like my cheetah print blanket. Uh, it would fuck everything up, and that's kind of like he's he's not coasting with the bullshit, right? And I liked um, Logan's comment about how, yeah, he's calling out all these institutions and these institutions of power that are sort of, kind of manipulating us and playing us like puppets and things like that. But in that, he's also sort of pointing out our role in that, right? Like, we're not guilt free in this whole shit show, right? Um, we, on some level, would rather it be this way. That's what he's saying. Like, coasting with the bullshit is like, it's just easy to let the government do whatever it is they're going to do as long as it doesn't affect me directly, right? It's easy for us to slip into this. Oh, the distractions, right? The illusion of choice. I love that when he talks about that. He's like, we have tons of choice in things that don't matter, right? There's, you know, whatever, 58 flavors. There's 1,000 channels now. There's 1,000 streaming services. Um, there's, I mean, the soda aisle at the grocery store is like an entire aisle. You can pick any kind of soda you want. Like, but when it comes down to things that matter, right? Big media companies, there's like a handful. Oil companies, there's like two, right? Political parties, two. Um, no choice, limited choice, right? Limited choice when it matters, tons of choice when it doesn't. And that always, for some reason, that resonates with me. It's like, that's the illusion of choice, the illusion of freedom, the illusion of free will. Is like, oh, I can pick whatever I want. Can you, though? When it really comes down to it? Can you? So, again, like, some of you mentioned it in your comments. Forrest mentioned it, like, just the thinking aspect of Carlin. I think it's the first time this semester, maybe a little with Bruce, but he really started to put together intellect and humor, right? That they are not mutually exclusive as many uh, perceived and still do perceive, right? I may have mentioned that here, like just teaching classes like this at Binghamton, I run into that where it's like, oh, but it's just this stupid class about jokes. And I'm like, yeah, well, it's a lot more than that, right? Assuming that you don't need to be cognitively agile and intellectual in some way to understand humor is sort of, well, bullshit and irresponsible as an academic, I would argue. Um, but Forrest talked about that. Like, there's a thinking component to this, where it's like, I'm not just going to the show to be distracted and entertained and giggle a few times, right? I'm going to the show to sort of, I don't want to say challenge myself, that might be giving it too much credit, but challenge my own beliefs. And back to Logan's comment, challenge my, like, my role in all of this, like re-examine my role in all of this. You know, it's obviously gotten away from us, right? Society has gotten away from us, and Carlin was sort of, screaming this into a megaphone for, has been for years, years and years. So I'm just going over my old notes that I can barely read. Oh, Carlin was a um, really interested in language, and some of you noted it um, in your comments, right? You can tell, like, a lot of his stuff was written and recited and memorized, like word for word, like every word counts, kind of thing. That whole bit, the modern man bit, right? Um, all those kinds of things. But I can't remember who mentioned it. It was Logan. But Forrest even talked about this, like, some of it, his stuff is poetic. He loved language, and he was interested in how it was this thing that we take for granted. I mean, how often do you think about the words you use, the words we use, the way we communicate, and the power that it carries, right? How often? Never. He was really interested in it. So the bit where he talks about how we've softened language to conceal our sins, right? Um, that's a great bit, and it came at a time, he that was from the mid '90s, I think, which was really when the PC movement started to really take hold, and he noticed this, like, as it's happening, like, this is what, it's a slippery slope to pretty much where we are now, where, you know our First Amendment rights are being infringed upon because we're telling people what they can and can't say. And it started there, and he noticed it as this institutional sort of commandeering of language, right? Manipulating of language to sort of take the conceal our sins was the term that he uses. So he was super interested in the hypocrisy, the inconsistencies, and how those things shape the way we think and live. Like, language shapes the way we think, for sure. And it shapes our lives in ways that we don't ever think about. He thought about it, right? He did it. He talked about it a lot. And he cared about language. It's funny, I always, when I'm teaching this course, like in the spring or fall or whatever, full semester, we'll talk about Carlin, now talk about Gallagher. I don't know if any of you know Gallagher. He's the guy who smashed watermelons with a huge, like, hammer. Just hacky, like, but more, again, traditional comedian. Like, if you just ask a layman, like, what's a comedian? Like, more of them will say Gallagher than, or Seinfeld than, like, Carl, whatever. Anyway, Gallagher does this whole bit. I mean, he's a hack. He's a complete hack. But he does this whole bit about language. But you know what he focuses on? Like, basically homonyms. Like, words that sound the same but are spelled differently or something. So it's like, D-U-M-B, dumb? No. it's it's so bad, but like people are like dying. Like, how come you park in the driveway and drive on the parkway? Right? That like, whoa, language is crazy. Um, so like this is what I mean about like comedy, good comedy, right? Here's Carlin like breaking down the ways in which these major institutions use language to manipulate us and sort of conceal their sins. I keep saying that, but that's his term. Um, and here's Gallagher doing like, hey, some words sound the same, but don't aren't spelled the same. Isn't that hilarious? Right? Like, it's just that's comedy, good comedy, comedy, right? Um, there's so many things in that sort of that mashup, that mixtape, the Carlin mixtape that you guys watched. Um, he kind of hints at he really sort of forecasts the Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if any of you guys watch that, but he talks about that, about how conservatives, the whole um, pro-life thing is bullshit. They basically want women to be, I think he says, brood mares for the state, right? Which is literally the premise of Handmaid's Tale, right? Um, so he foresaw this. Now, I want to get to Logan. Kind of talks about this where I think you referred to him as like sort of a guy on the street, like almost like, maybe you didn't say this, but this is where I went with it. Like he has this like crazy guy, tinfoil, almost tinfoil hatty kind of guy on the street, just ranting and raving. So it's like a lot of times in humor, when you get to Carlin's level, and he's guilty of this at times, there's a very fine line between like crazy, angry, prophetic, preachy, right? Where it's like it's still got to be funny. So like that's where he was at his most successful, is when he makes those bits that are about these big, heavy things. He makes them funny. Sometimes he can get into a preachy mode. No one likes to be preached to, right? So when it's easy to get to that point, and he was the best at. Not that he did it all the time, but he was the best at really walking that line between, you know, preaching and being and preaching and prophesizing, but angry, but still um, thinking critically, right? And it's a tough balance. It's hard to find. There are bits and times when I'm like, all right, this is a little heavy-handed, and no one wants that from anybody, let alone their comedian. So, he talks about finding the line and deliberately crossing it, right? Like that's kind of what he saw as his job. Um, but it's always interesting to see like the bit about rights is so good, and it's funny, and it's true, and it's like, yeah, like that's just, he hit the sweet spot on all that stuff. And he is. I mean, I think he's like 80 years old when he's doing that show. That was his final live. That was his final special. Um, so he does have this angry old man thing, but there's way more layers to it. Um, so there's that. Um, I often say this, like the perceived anger of Carlin is evidence that something is at stake here, right? These aren't just jokes for him. There's more than just jokes, right? What he's saying matters. What we say matters. How we talk matters. And Louis C.K., who's a huge, a huge descendant of Carlin, did a lot with language like that. Like he does a whole bit about. Think about the way we talk now. It's embarrassing. Um, and all this stuff about, again, Carlin sort of turning it back on the audience, regardless of their political affiliation or their race or their gender or whatever it is. He kind of gets pissed, like we squandered our brains, right? We gave we traded in our brains for money and shit, right? Things. Um, like, didn't we though? We kind of did. Um, I love when he talks about the the media. Where did I write that? Over here. Media is public relations for the government, right? And this whole thing that every so often, I mean, every decade maybe or 20 years or so, there's a big public outcry, right? And it's generally generated by the government, and the media sort of promotes it, and then there's this, right? So there was the war on crime, right? And that was Nixon. It was 100% Nixon. Like you can look that up. Nixon was literally like sort of inventing this thing. Um, War on crime, war on drugs, war on terror. I don't know what one we're in now. I guess that's probably war on identity, maybe. I don't know. That doesn't fit in line with those three, but maybe that's just how sad things are now. But what happens is the government does this thing, the media ramps it up. Like in the 70s, crime wasn't as bad as the media was portraying it to be. I'm not saying it was great, but same thing with drugs and terror. But what they use those as is disguises to take away our freedoms, right? Crime, war on crime. We got to crack down and all that, kind of clean up the streets, all that. Um, and with that came fewer rights for criminals and prisoners and things like that. Same thing with war on drugs, right? Draconian sentences, like just for, you know, holding or, right, really, again, stripping freedoms and rights from people. And then the war on terror was, the Patriot Act and things like that, like our privacy. And, well, now we can do all these things. Well, every move like that, we start to take away things from average citizens. And I mentioned in the little description, like, he was really the first, like, people started to say, hey, what do you think? What does Carlin think about this? Right? And he would testify. I think he testified in front of Congress, and he went on, like, there's a couple like interview segments on stuff like that where people started to care about his opinions, right, more than his jokes, or vice versa. Um, so that's always, like, he made that a new thing, like incorporated this whole, uh, again, the philosopher thing, which you know, you can take all these comedians that we watch and you can sort of place them in that jester, poet, philosopher sort of, you can place them in those different modes of their careers. And I don't know, not many get to philosopher as far as I can tell. Many get stuck in the jester phase. Um, but I think that's a really great way to look at it, right? The jokes should adorn the ideas eventually. Like, yeah, you're going to start out, you're just going to be funny, right? Get laughs any way possible. but eventually there's got to be more than that, right? So the jokes adorning the ideas is, he says that in that little interview. Just, I'm like, yeah, that. He talks a lot about in in the mashup thing, right? We just want to focus on the negatives. That whole idea, which is, I mean, it's pretty much true. Idea that the government in corporate America, like the institutions that basically run the country, they're invested in keeping us fighting and distracted from things that really matter. So, like, this whole identity politics thing that we're mired in right now is keeping our eyes off of, you know, all the things that are wrong with our government and our, you know, and lobbyists and corporations and all those kinds of things. Um, so when he talks about, um, you know, like keeping us, like focusing on our what separates us instead of what unites us. You know, I think we have more in common than we care to admit or realize, um, but always keeping us divided, right, based on race or gender or sexuality or income or education or all of these kinds of things, so that we're just bitching with each other while they run away to the bank, as he says. Lots of that kind of stuff. Um, um, I don't know, I'm just kind of skipping around here. The one story that I love from that interview is when he talks about the nuns, right? It's like, you know, he has this career that's growing, and his mom just like, oh, he just the cursing, and I don't know. She was like embarrassed of him basically because he cursed and he, you know, talked about some pretty off-color things, right? And you know that these nuns went up to his mother and were like, "No, don't you see what he's doing? Like, this is such a progressive way to look at it, and it's I think the right way to look at comedy is like he's doing those things, he's using that language, he's doing those things, he's talking about these things to make a larger point, right? It's not just there for uh, to be silly or to be shocking or whatever. He's using all of his language and his brain and all this stuff to sort of, you know, illuminate these different ideas and think critically about things. And for her to be like, oh, now I'm on board because it's been validated by these two nuns, like that's kind of what, you know, yeah, some people just need to hear it from some other people, if that makes any sense. Um, but that story, like they get it, like, and his mom didn't get it. I told my mom, like, my mom's kind of the same way. Like, oh, why do you have to curse and all that stuff? I'm like, really? Like, because she thinks I'm going to go to hell, or whatever that means. And I'm just like, you really think I'm going to go to hell? You know me. You raised me. I'm a good person, right? I have, you know, good to my family and friends, and I'm kind and caring, and you really think I'm gonna go to hell because I said fuck a couple times? Like that's insane. Like Hitler is for hell. Hitler's for hell. Hell is for Hitler and the Backstreet Boys. Like that's basically, you know, that's my take on it. Like I don't murder people. I don't. Yeah, like really. That was path here. Um, so I've mentioned a bunch of the comments so far. Um, Forrest talking about the poeticism. I don't even know if that's a word, but the language thing and making you think, like that's huge, huge, huge. Um, Tyler talked about the audience reflection. Like it compels an audience, a halfway attentive audience, to reflect on like their role in all of this, which is kind of back to what Logan was saying about our role in all this. It's supposed to make you think. And I think since Carlin, we've seen an increase, maybe not immediately, but in the last, like, I would say 15 years of comedy, you're seeing a lot more performers who are invested in that. Like, I don't just want to make them laugh, I want to make them think too. Um, so maybe there is this progress that, those things aren't mutually exclusive. Um, Combining the intellect with the humor, we'll get to that, right? There's this, Carlin seems to not only acknowledge the connection between the two, but embrace it and flaunt it, if you will. So I think that was a good pickup. Um, Shruti, I liked this. He doesn't care about the consequences of what he's saying. And then my addition to that would be he does care because he doesn't care about the consequences of what he's saying because he does care so much about the results of what he's saying, of him saying what he's saying, if that makes any sense. It's back to what I was saying before about, he's so passionate and angry, like, that you can tell, like, there's something at stake for him. So he's like, I'm gonna say this. I might get in trouble. You might not like me, but I'm gonna say it because I care and I want you to sort of think about it, right? So he doesn't care about the consequences. He doesn't give a fuck, as it were. But I'll tell you what he does give a fuck about, and that's like change, the results of what he's of saying what he's saying. It's like, you guys know Lewis Black, like the difference between, like, Carlin is like, it's true passion and anger and sort of fury, and Lewis Black does this whole, well, this very political comedy, but his and he has this thing where he screams a lot when he gets angry, and like that's all calculated, like that's in written in his set is, oh, now I scream this line or get increasingly angry, like it's manufactured. Carlin is just, that's how he feels, if that makes any sense. um, so yeah, I like that. And I mentioned Logan's stuff. So that's your Carlin video. Um, keep keep posting comments, and I'll keep posting these, and round and round it goes. It's really, I mean, it's not hard. I would hope that you would find some enjoyment in it. If not yet, then soon. So, um, I'll talk to you guys again.